Well, hello. My name is LaDawn Johnson, and I am here to present Race, Class, Gender, and the American Dream. But before we get started, I just wanted to say a quick word of prayer, and we'll go from there. All right. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much, God, just for your hand of protection on each of these individuals as they've come to this conference, Lord, and we thank you that you have allowed us to have a space to talk about these things that are sometimes difficult even in our churches and our families, God. It's sometimes things that can be a source of pain or frustration. And Lord, I just thank you that you've given us a place to do that. And God, that your Spirit is here to help us through these things. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Well, before I get started, I would love to hear a little bit about you guys. So just a quick show of hands. How many of you are coming from out of state? Is anyone? Okay. So can you tell me what places are you guys coming from? What states?
Oregon.
Oregon. Okay.
Washington.
Illinois.
Okay.
Minnesota.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think you're our farthest so far. Who else? Where else? Anywhere else? All right. Well, I'll just tell you a little bit about me. I know there's a little blurb in there, but I am a Californian, but Northern Californian. So for anybody who lives in NorCal, you know that there's a difference. Although I've lived here for the last 20 years, lived in Los Angeles downtown for several years before moving to this area and coming to Biola. You know, I've had a heart for people who have been marginalized for quite a while. I had a lot of experiences in my own life that kind of shaped this passion that I've had, and God has opened up many doors for me in my life to be able to do things that I never thought I would be able to do in terms of even just traveling. I was able to go to over 32 countries and just got home from Ukraine. My husband and I adopted 2 teenagers from Ukraine. So we are a very international, trilingual family. We speak Spanish, Ukrainian, and English in our home. So just coming from my own experiences, when I came to Biola to start teaching, I was so excited because it gave me an opportunity to talk with students about things that typically we shy away from. And I know this conference is one of these opportunities that many of you have. For the first time ever, you might be able to start talking about these things in a place that feels a little safer than others. Today, my hope is that as I'm presenting the information to you guys, that you would feel empowered to be able to speak up, ask questions, or interject. So that's my hope for our time today. What's our finishing time? My person just, what's our?
12?
Yeah.
12. And then we'll end like 5 minutes later, so I can go ahead and about the survey.
Great. So that's just a little synopsis of our time today. Before I get started, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. So far, what has been the most impactful thing that you've heard or that has resonated with you in this conference today, up to date? Is there anything that you feel comfortable sharing that has been something that stood out to you, that has felt comfortable or impactful? Yeah.
Impactful. I heard in the Fire Love Jesus session, one of the speakers actually said that it's mind-boggling for him to understand that the very presence of someone can be oppressive. He didn't get that. So that was kind of impactful for me to engage and see where people are at.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Anyone else? What has stood out to you so far in your sessions or in the speaking times? Hi, there's some space in here. Yeah, you guys feel free to hang out there. That's perfect. That's great. All right, well, today I'm going to go ahead and just get started. To me, it's always interesting to hear because one of the biggest things for me is to make sure that some of this stuff is connecting in a large way for you guys and that the time and the effort that you've put in here is important for us to know and make sure that you guys are feeling that this is somehow impacting you or creating some sense of thoughts or things like that. I'm going to kind of throw at the beginning of my talk today, I'm going to kind of be throwing a few sociological terms and kind of social science terms at you, just to give you kind of a foundation of where, why the information that I'm going to be giving you is important. So first off, I want to start with this idea of intersectionality. These tend to be cultural patterns, and if you're not familiar with this word of intersection, basically what we do is we look at different areas and systems and groups, and we try to figure out like what dynamics are going on that are kind of multi-layered. It kind of, instead of just kind of looking at one specific aspect of social life, we're looking at several combined and kind of seeing how those combinations create a kind of difference or a different situation for different members in society. So cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated, but they're bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society. So that's kind of the foundation of what I'm presenting to you guys today, is that we want to look at different aspects of why some people have greater access to things in life than others. So social stratification is another kind of way that we look at these things. And this is the study of, let's see, there it is. The study of systematic inequality between groups of people. So this kind of hand in hand with what we're doing here today is looking at the intersections of social stratification. So today I want to present to you guys just what I call the axis of inequality. There's several different accesses that we can use, but for today we're going to use race and ethnicity. We're going to look at gender and social class. And I wish we had time to look at ability as well, because this is also another aspect of how able-bodied you are can also impact your experience as an American or in America. I'm wondering if one of you guys can you click that top? Thank you. Can you see that better now? Great. So I kind of want to start out with just looking at America as kind of this idea that we have of America the Beautiful. What are some of the things that people say about being in America? Can you guys think of some ideas or have some ideas about what America might represent to some people? Freedom. Land of opportunity, great. So America the Beautiful, we've had these different ideas and concepts that float around the globe. They can be everything from just being able to immigrate to a better life, the land of opportunity. So I have the Golden Gate Bridge here. To this idea of Disneyland. We think about Disneyland, and I don't know if you guys have ever been there or visited there, but the whole Main Street area is supposed to be somehow reflective of America and the American ideal. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of see what that perspective brings to us. But a lot of times we kind of think of these like small town little streets with cute little like shops, and we kind of have this idea of it in a Disneyland way. And then also Wall Street financial aspects of it as well. So you guys helped me. Land of opportunity. One of the other narratives that we get a lot is this idea of rags to riches, that anyone can become rich or famous or a president. In our state here, you can even become a governor. We had Governor Schwarzenegger, who had not come from this country, and he was able to become governor of California. So there's ideas of being able, and he's also married into kind of an American aristocracy, I guess, in the Kennedys. So he's kind of had this rags to riches story that a lot of us feel is a part of the American experience and seeing ourselves as American. Also, we have these ideas that jobs and education are available to all, especially who want it. And that social class is achieved, not ascribed. So we kind of, in our history, have had this kind of distinction. We see ourselves having a distinction as being able to create our own destiny, not being bound by where our parents were from, feeling that we have a lot of opportunity for social mobility and things like that. So individuals feel like they can decide what class to belong to, and we feel that there's a lot of open mobility, like I mentioned. And then one of the greatest kind of narratives that we see happening in the American culture and the idea of identifying yourself as an American and as a successful American is this idea of meritocracy. So how many of you guys know what meritocracy means? Good, awesome. So I like to kind of summarize it by skill and effort equal reward. That basically this idea that if I work hard and given these certain skills that I've been given, that I am going to achieve a certain payoff. There's going to be a payoff for me. So we've had these stories of rags to riches. This is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a poor Scottish immigrant and was able to come to the United States and build one of the largest steel companies during the late 1800s, early 1900s. He actually founded Carnegie Steel that later became U.S. Steel, and his family is still able to benefit from the wealth that he had created early on. Then we have Rocky. How many of you guys have ever seen these movies? We see in Rocky this idea of this guy from the streets able to use his skill and all of the training that he puts in. I just remember this one scene where he's like running up the stairs in Philadelphia, and it's like he's turning around because he's just so able to, and he has rewards for this. He becomes wealthy, he becomes well notarized, things like that. So we have these ideas, we have these kind of symbols in our society and these narratives that run through our society that say anybody can make it here. But I know you guys are here today because you know that that's not true. There are a lot of obstacles for people in the United States to be able to kind of meet these, rewards that other people seem to so freely be given, right? So I'm sure that some of the stuff that I'm going to be presenting in the next maybe 10 minutes, you guys have already heard of before, but I find it necessary to make sure that we have that so we can have a little bit of a discussion for this. So I'm going to talk about class first. I'm going to look at the issue of social class in the United States. And every different discipline has a way of trying to say this is what's going on. And every sociological perspective will divide it into different ideas about what social class means and how we would divide people into that. Today I'm going to focus on a few aspects of class and how I've broken this down. The first one is wealth. Just looking at wealth is a huge aspect of how someone is able to sustain a certain life and a certain aspect of privilege in life. We're also going to, this includes things like valued possessions, cash, land, buildings, property. Then income, the money that we get from employment or any kind of shares or things like that is also attached to it. It tends to be intergenerational. It's not necessarily something that is just one person is able to do, although we have those stories out there and those examples. And then the other aspect of class is the aspect of power. So when I'm in a social class, what kind of, what am I limited in? What do I have power over? This is the ability to carry out one's will, even if opposed by others. That's how I'm seeing it in this. So who has power? That's one of the questions that we ask in sociology. Who has power in society? The last aspect of this I want to look at is the aspect of prestige. Some people may call this status or prestige. This is the respect that is given to people that have valued possessions or resources. We even know that occupationally people are given prestige even though they may not be making as much as other people. So for example, teachers are given a lot of prestige, but we know financially they're not doing fantastic. They're not in the upper kind of areas in social class. So I want to present to you guys maybe 5 scenarios of social class. And like I said, this is controversial. There's other ways of breaking this down, but today I just wanted to do it for the sake of our discussion. So this is Alice Walton. She's the Walmart heiress. And she's actually, in 2007, she was worth $19 billion. And today, she's actually worth $39 billion. So that's her net wealth. So I call these individuals part of the upper class. These are the groups that are actually carry a great amount of wealth. So let's look at these 3 things here. First of all, what percentage do you think of Americans belong to this upper class? 1%? Well, less than 1? Okay, so let's look at that. It is actually less than 1. It's 0.5% of the population would belong to this class. So the extent of wealth the top 1%, so we're going to obviously see another 0.5 in a minute. The top 1% owns more than 1/3 of all net wealth that there is. So what that means is that everything that there is to have, including land, property, money, all of this, that 1/3 of what is available to all Americans is owned by 1% of the population. It's pretty intense. So 50% of US stocks, 60% of bonds, corporations, property, inheritance, income mostly come from investments and not employment. So we see that the folks that are in this kind of upper class are really not having to work anymore. They've kind of made a certain amount of wealth and they don't have to actually be employed or be getting a salary or anything like that. So the source of power obviously becomes ownership of resources, because we know money makes money, right? So if I own the businesses, then I'm able to make more money and use it as I want. There's also economic power and political power that are often intertwined. We know that. So the source of prestige is a family name and the resources. So folks like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Walton, Sam Walton, and Getty, and now newly we're seeing like the Gates family and things like that as part of this group. So a couple of the things to think about is that this is already happening. So how many percentage of women do you think are a part of this group? Anybody? So 1% of all the women in the United States, 1% are a part of this group. So that means out of all the women that are in the workforce and not in the workforce, only 1%, they only comprise 1% of this point of 1%. Does that make sense? So they're like barely represented. Now let's think of it in terms of race and ethnicity in this country. We have maybe 10 people of color that we can put into this category in the United States in this top 0.5%. It's pretty small, okay? So let's look at the other 0.5 here. We have the corporate class. These are the CEOs. I don't know if you guys are, I think you're probably too young to remember Enron and all of the energy issues and scandal that went on with that, but these guys are former Enron CEOs, and boy, they were making a lot of money until they got caught. So, so obviously this is our other 0.5%. So what is the extent of wealth of those who are in as CEOs? So it's a lot. That's, in summary, they're making a lot. They have a lot of wealth, but it's not as much as the upper class. They're not worth billions. At most, maybe $1 billion. Okay, usually because of their own investments and things outside of their job. And usually they are not the main owners of these corporations or companies in the US. They just are sitting and they're in a position of decision making. So the median CEO salary is around $10 million a year. That's a lot of money, right? But it's not as much as Alice Walton, who has $40 billion at her disposal every year. Okay, so even within the 1%, we go from billions to millions. So there's even a divide amongst the top 1%, okay? So for example, we think about the President of the United States, okay? Not even the most powerful position in our country doesn't even hit what CEOs are making. So the source of power for these individuals are that they are heads of companies, and oftentimes, like I said, there's kind of an interesting, like intertwined relationship within government, and there's a lot of influence and the ability to be able to throw money at lobby groups and be able to court certain government ideas. The other thing is the source of prestige. So obviously there's a lot because they're in a position of influence, and they actually have a lot of affluence as well. So, sorry I'm running through this pretty quick, but I want to make sure we can get to our discussion today. So, so middle class. I grew up in the 80s, and this was my favorite family, and they were painted as a typical American middle class family. Has anyone ever watched this show? Okay. What does Dr. Huxtable do? He's a doctor, right? He's actually, I think, a pediatrician or something, or obstetrician. That's it. And then, what does Claire do? She's a lawyer. So we have two of these most, so much prestige, and they're still middle class. We have a lawyer and a doctor, and they're still middle class. Okay, so I thought that was kind of interesting. So as we look at middle class facts, what percentage of Americans do you think fall into this kind of middle class? Kind of the Huxtable middle class. Anybody have an idea? How many of you think it's over 20%? Over 20%? Okay, under 20%? It's actually 43% of Americans. So we have a very large group that is attached to what I would consider the middle class, and other researchers might agree with me. So the extent of wealth is that there's some, and a lot of it is in ownership. So a lot of them own homes, they own land. This is where we see their wealth. Maybe they've inherited money from their family, maybe not a lot, but they've had money inherited. So just to give some medium to high income, so median earnings in the country, so my guy from Minnesota probably can attest to this, but we don't make as much money in certain areas of the country as we do in big cities and larger cities. And so our median income earnings tend to be under $100,000 for the average middle class person, working person. They're not really making a whole lot of money. And oftentimes, as we see out here in California, we have two people in the home who are working. So there's a lot of disparity between even what kind of wealth the middle class might have and how we see that. So source of power is limited within the context of occupation. So if you're a manager, then you have some sense of prestige. If you are a boss or something like that, or a supervisor of like teachers or whatever, then you will have a sense of a source of prestige, but very limited. Or source of power, I'm sorry. Source of prestige is also very limited. So source of power, very limited. Source of prestige, very limited. And these are what we typically call white-collar jobs. These are the ones where you're not necessarily having to use manual labor or skills. Okay, so 43% in that. Then we have the working class. Okay, this is what we would call blue-collar workers. My husband was a police officer for 10 years in Alabama, of all places. And he started out in his career making $19,000. And after 10 years, he was making a whopping $23,000. Okay. Out here in California, very different. You start out around $60,000 as a police officer if you're in the city, and then you can actually end up around $80,000. So it depends on where you live. But that even here is not, it's hard to buy a house if you're only making $60,000. Like there's just, that's almost impossible here. So what percentage of Americans? 43%. So there's a 43% that are making, that I consider working class. And this also, the extent of wealth in this is very little. Very little. There is some home ownership, but very little. Again, might have inherited a family land or something, or if they're lucky enough to have, be able to invest wisely with their earnings. But typically we see a lot of working class folks really working paycheck to paycheck. They're living paycheck to paycheck. There's not really a savings account that's there. So the income is very middle to low. So factory workers around $24,000, machine operators around $23,000. Okay. We have seen kind of a resurgence of some of these types of jobs where you're actually making more, so if you become specialized in a specific field, like if you become a crane operator, you can actually be making $80,000 a year. So the more specialized you get in manual labor, there are opportunities to make money, but not very often, and those are very difficult positions to get. So the source of power for this group is limited and usually happens through collective means. So unions are really a huge part of how individuals in this working class are able to mobilize. And source of prestige, very little in blue-collar jobs. So now in thinking about women, gender differences, especially in this, we recognize that almost 40% of all women in the United States are working, almost trying to, in the workforce. So we have 40% of women in the workforce. And what we have found is that the majority of women that are working in the workforce tend to be in service-oriented jobs or jobs that we would consider more blue collar, maybe able to hang a little bit towards the upper end of this, maybe reaching towards that middle class. But we see a lot of women, and they tend to be women who are like single and single parents. So as we do some of these breakdowns, we're seeing women represented. And one of the things that is most disturbing is that when we add in the idea of ethnicity and race on top of that, then we see that certain groups of women are not able to access certain professions. So I'll give you an example from my own life, that there's very few Hispanic professors in university systems. As females, we're actually the lowest represented. There's more Native American professors than there are female Hispanic professors. And it's very low. So we recognize that the ethnicity can play a part in these systems of even economic systems, job systems, these systems of wealth and wealth accumulation, things like that. But we recognize that these things the intersection of all these things can create a very complex path for people. Okay. Let me present this last group here. So lower class, some people like to call underclass. I don't like that terminology, because if there's an underclass, you have to acknowledge there's an overclass. That's what Tim Wise says. I like that. But an underclass, I don't like that. So we call it lower class here. What percentage of Americans do you think? What's left? Anybody want to do some quick math? 13%. So it's 13% of people that would be considered in this lower class. What's the extent of wealth? Very little, usually none. I lived for a long time down in downtown LA, and one of the aspects of living there was interacting with the homeless population. And I noticed very quickly that they're very attached to, like, if you've ever seen them with shopping carts, whatever, they're very attached. And it dawned on me when I was in college that this is the only thing that they own. This is the only thing that represents who they are or what they're doing with their lives on the street in terms of wealth or ownership. So, but usually there's very little ownership, very little wealth, obviously, for individuals. So income, well, in 2001, the poverty rate was around 9.9%. We, during 2007, kind of saw it rise for a while. Hurricane Katrina and different kind of natural disasters kind of added to that. But we've generally kind of stuck within that area. And only about 1/3 of the poor actually are accessing welfare who can qualify for welfare. So it's not like all of these people that are struggling financially are on welfare and getting assistance. So very, very few are able to do that. So the source of power, limited to none. I mean, that's not a very powerful position to be in when you are trying to figure out how to get your next meal. So source of prestige, limited to none. I don't think any of us aspire to be in that position. We really are working hard to not be in that position. So just really quickly, just wanted to kind of recap in terms of the financial aspect of this. When we look at the top 1%, we're looking at billions and millions. We look at middle class and maybe a couple 100,000 to maybe 500,000. But we're not looking at millions of dollars in terms of wealth. And then we're looking at the working class, who's maybe making at most $100,000, but mostly under. So there's a huge disparity between those who are on top. There's a huge gap. Okay, in that. And like I said, we've kind of seen a couple examples of how it becomes more complicated in who you are. So I want to ask you guys to do me a favor. I would like you to turn to maybe 2 or 3 of you, and I would like you to try to come up with an example of can you close that door? Do you mind coming in and closing that door? Thank you. So I was wanting to see if you guys can come up with an example. It could be fictional or it can be real, of maybe someone who falls in one of these categories and analyze the racial, ethnic component, the gendered component, and which class that they fit into. Because I'm curious to hear if you guys feel that there are individuals in society who are not able to obtain what everyone else is able to obtain. Does that make sense? Kind of a weird question, but I want you guys to spend let me re-clarify that. So in your groups, I want you guys to sit and discuss maybe an example of how you have seen obstacles for individuals based on race, ethnicity, social class, and gender. And then we'll come back together, so it's a little bit clearer of an instruction. So let's take about 5 minutes. All right, so if I could have you guys go ahead and wrap up. We'll have a more opportunity for you guys to share with each other as we kind of keep going on. But I'm curious to hear maybe a couple of examples that you guys come up with, or even reactions to this information. Does anyone feel comfortable to share what your group was discussing? Yeah.
We were talking about wealth. So wealth in this country is, usually passed down through property for the middle class. So when you start looking at histories of segregated housing laws, history of being able to get a job, et cetera, you have certain people that look a certain way who the bank wouldn't give a home loan. And so there's this kind of myth that you have where you say, oh, you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? But in America, that's not really true. You pull yourself up because you get some help. Like you get a loan. Mom and dad maybe give you a couple grand here, a couple grand there. Where'd they get that money from their parents, from the house that they sold, when they died? So there's kind of this myth that like all that kind of just appears. But if you don't have access to those things because of the color of your skin, then you're not able to have the same opportunities as maybe somebody else who's generationally had those opportunities.
Absolutely.
And historically, that goes back even to owning a plantation versus being a sharecropper.
Absolutely.
That was disproportionately racialized. So
Absolutely.
that wealth isn't just one generation, 2 generations. It's like Wall Street is built on the bodies of slaves. Like literally, they found the slave cemetery under Wall Street. Like that's the kind of foundation.
Absolutely.
Of the economic system. So.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a really, really amazing book. I'm sure you guys have heard of this before, but if you haven't, I would suggest you read it. It's called American Apartheid by Massey. And it was one of the first big studies that was done. There's been several follow-ups that they've done with Massey, but it was the first big study that looked at kind of the realities of even real estate and who has access to that. And what they found is that oftentimes real estate agents would shy away people of color, in particular African Americans, from being able to invest in certain areas, and it created a lot of segregation and created a lot of, the kind of going along with that term, location, like that plays into it, race and ethnicity. And they found that when persons of color moved into specific neighborhoods, that the way that people in that neighborhood would react would actually depreciate the value of homes in that neighborhood. So they found a big tie. So American Apartheid is an amazing book that looks at that, and I would suggest reading that if you're interested. Yeah?
Following up from owning our groups from Chicago and Moody Bible Institute, and we're working with students in government housing, children in government housing and mentoring them. And so being in Chicago, the first time I learned about redlining and how recent that has been removed, and if it even really has been removed, and living a block away from Old Cabrini Green and working with children in those neighborhoods, the kind of case and situation that we were looking at were the lives and the incomes of our little sibs, and the opportunities that they do or do not have based off of where they were born and the neighborhoods they were born and raised into. A lot of that, because of the history of America, has a lot is racially profiled, is profiled within a certain class, and how limited those opportunities are versus the children who have a different education, or whose parents, because of their job, have different energy to pour into them. You're tired and you can't do certain things when you're working a labor job versus a stay-at-home mom. You don't have to work. You're living off of your or your job is sitting at an office desk.
Absolutely.
So, and those are in Chicago, literally the difference between what side of the street you live on.
Absolutely.
We can work as a student babysitting for one family of kids, and you're being paid so much to basically raise this person's child, and then we step across the street and we're hanging out with our little sibs. So that difference in it goes back to the redlining. It goes back to where your property is.
And it's happening in Los Angeles as well. So, you know, downtown LA, I worked and lived there for a long time, and that exact thing was going on. And every time there'd be a new development, there would be a promise by the mayor and the police chief that certain groups of people would not be able to access even the street. So they would go in and pick up homeless population and literally take them and literally dump them in a different area of the city. So yeah, there's a lot of things like redlining that go on. There's a lot of, like, you know, backdoor conversations that happen about how space is going to be relegated to certain groups of people, and definitely that is going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off of this and just, I think it's necessary to note that these divisions are not static.
Right.
They're very permeable. So people of color, women, trans folks, queer folks are constantly pushed back against, no matter how far up they may get, there's a constant pushback against them fundamentally. Like y'all were talking about redlining and stuff. You've got people who are of middle class, you know, because of their education, because of their background, because they worked that hard, but everything else around them is pushing back so hard that it's very likely that they will not stay middle class.
Yeah.
And the only reason why certain classes are able to stay static and where they are at is because of their race, is because of their because of their whiteness, because of their maleness, because of their straightness, because of their access to higher education. And people of color and black folks, no matter how much access they get to that, because of whatever little scraps people may throw at them through affirmative action or whatever, like that still does not guarantee them any stability.
Absolutely, and that's what we're kind of seeing when we look at even this group right here. This percentage, to me, is pretty high. It's pretty crazy that we have more people in poverty than we have in a wealth situation, right? 1% versus 13%, that's pretty crazy as a society. So if we look at, though, if I were to break down and give you guys a bunch of statistics of who is growing into this, we are seeing single women, single parents, women of color, that are growing and growing and growing into this because the inability to have care for children and at the same time access certain types of jobs that are being denied, even through systems being denied. So good. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, it's just like going off of what you were saying, as far as like, it's kind of like in this newer generation where we as African American minorities and different groups are getting educations and stuff, but it's still like we can have all the wealth, but we'll still never have the prestige or the respect. And so it's kind of like this new form of racism. Like, I don't know if you listen to interviews like Kanye West and different things like that, like how he's saying, I have all this wealth and power, but I still, like, it's this new type of racism where I don't have the prestige. And so it's like, how do we fight that? You know, you can still have all this money, but no one's going to respect you.
Yeah, it's a very, very horrible position to be in our country, where you can be a hardworking, all the meritocracy in the world, and you're not getting the reward. You're not getting the reward of these things that I've laid out here. So yes, definitely. Who else? Who else feels comfortable to share what your group is talking about? Okay. I say comfortable because sometimes it's not comfortable to share this stuff, right? So we recognize that, through the examples, hopefully you guys were able to kind of key into the fact that there are certain groups of people who can be working their butts off and they're not getting anywhere. They're not getting land. They're not getting access to wealth accumulation. There's none of that happening for them. So we know that these things are going on, and we know that people in society are constantly making excuses for not having to deal with it, right? I mean, I'm sure if I sat here and asked you guys to give me a list of the things that you've heard when you bring these topics up to your friends or to other people outside of your community, the things that get said back to you. I'm going to give you guys a little bit. Alan G. Johnson has a book called Privilege, Power, and Difference that I really, really like. And he has, I'm just going to kind of float quickly through these if it'll let me move through this stuff. I'm going to move through this stuff kind of quickly here. Okay. So he kind of has 7 different aspects of what people use, like kind of categories of excuses that people use to do what he calls get off the hook of having to deal with this stuff. And I wanted to present this to you because I think that you're here not because you don't know the reality, but because you do know the reality. So I want to give you guys just maybe ways to strategize or understand why people don't care about these issues, okay? So the first one is large groups of people blame the victim. Johnson says that you can acknowledge that privilege and oppression exist, and even that they have terrible consequences for people, but still get off the hook by blaming it all on them. So things like, well, some women are just hypersensitive, right? Whenever you try to have a conversation, maybe, well, women are emotional. Or they had no business being there. In thinking about certain situations where women are maybe in a situation where they were raped or something, that we end up blaming her because, well, look how she was dressed and why was she out after midnight, right? We blame the victim on that. Or they were asking for it, right? So there's a lot of different things that can be said within this aspect of blame the victim, but all in all, it's very when that's happening to you and you feel victimized and nobody is like hearing that, hey, I am doing everything to meet you where you're at, and they're not working to meet you where you're at, it is so devastating. So blaming the victim is one of these things that happens. He also goes on to say that the result of this thinking is that oppression is blamed on the people who suffer from it most, while privilege and those who benefit remain invisible and relatively untouched and off the hook. So we don't have to deal with these things. Have you ever wondered why does the Christian community have such a hard time talking about these inequalities? It's because several of them are blaming the victim, okay? Or here's another one that he says, or people call it something else. This is a way also to avoid having to have this conversation. It's a more subtle way to deny that there's oppression and privilege in this country. So terms like the battle of the sexes is kind of one of these. We're really calling it something else other than the fact that we have a lot of inequality going on, gender inequality happening. Women are from Venus and men are from Mars. I don't know if you guys know that there was a book called that about 20 years ago. It was wildly popular, and it was an attempt to try to understand communication and differences between men and women, but it kind of resulted in being more categorical and kind of calling this issue something other than what it is. And this is the most highly developed in relation to gender inequality because women and men depend on one another in ways that other groups do not. So we also know that this happens when we talk about race and ethnicity and when we talk about ableism as well. Here's the third one. The excuse is, it's better this way. So when we talk about things like you had mentioned earlier, there were 3 or 4 of you that had talked about how there's actual residential segregation and there's really literally things that are happening to try to keep it that way, that the excuse becomes, well, you know, people like to live among their own kind, right? How many times have you heard that? But it's really whites who want to live with their own kind. That's what it ultimately results in, especially when we really look at who is in a position of power to be able to create those lines or draw those lines, right? They're not people of color, and probably not women of color. Okay. So economics is also used to justify segregation when really it is racism, or it is, you know, a gendered issue, okay, or one of our other isms. So our patriarchal culture promotes this kind of privilege. We promote this and say, oh, it is better this way. Not everybody can be the president of the United States. Not everybody can have the high-paying job. Not everybody can have access. And so people justify that we figured out it's working. Well, no, it's working for them, not working for everyone else. Yeah?
Could you elaborate a little bit on the economics point and how that's used to justify segregation?
Yeah, so you know, when we, and what Johnson is trying to say here actually too, is that when we see certain groups attached to specific roles like division of labor in our society here, we tend to kind of justify it through the use of economics by saying, you know, not like kind of what I was saying, like not everybody can be the CEO. Somebody's got to be the worker. Like there's this kind of like meritocracy type of thinking that somehow when somebody makes a lot of money, they've really earned it. I appreciate what you said earlier, because the fact is that even Carnegie is standing on the backs of children, women, and people of color to have made that wealth. And one of the ideas that we have in our American society is, oh, well, I'm standing on my own 2 feet, I pulled myself up from my bootstraps. And when we really stop and look at who has accumulated wealth, and we look at the history of how they did that, it was either free or cheap labor. It was, I'm going to even be bold enough to say, in many cases, it was exploitive. Okay. And so when we use these economics justification, this meritocracy type of thinking, then we justify what we really see as either racism or classism or, you know, ageism or things like that. Okay. Yeah.
Would you argue? You think this, some people think this. Do you think that it's true that everything that we're kind of seeing is a natural result of the capitalist free market economic system? You know what I'm saying? So the system's not broken; it's just working exactly like it's always worked this way. It's always worked on the back of the poor,
Yeah.
and the marginalized, you know, and that's how it functions.
Yeah. Well, you're trying to out me as a Marxist, so. Which,
Well, I didn't know that.
no, okay. No. Well, you know, look, it's a hard situation as in a Christian context, because we want to be so like, oh, we love capitalism and it's working, and there's some sort of identity that we've just like, you know, kind of just held on to, and we've fallen in love with this idea of how market systems work in our country. And for me personally, I think that whenever you start any kind of system, it's kind of like laying down train tracks, right? You've moved mountains, you've moved land, and you've laid down that train track. What other direction do you expect the train to go in except for the track you laid down? So if we're looking at 150 years ago, 200 years ago, when we started laying down these tracks of these systems that we have in our society, of course we're going to see the results be negative towards people of color, towards women, towards people of even alternative sexuality, right? Because all at the beginning, we weren't considering them, right? So of course, it's part of the system that we have now. Could it have been different? I think so. Do I blame capitalism in and of itself? As a Christian, I have conflicts with the idea of using money to make more money. You know, it seems a little conflictual for me theologically, but I get it. And I get how people enjoy that and see that as part of their identity and who they are. But just being honest, you know, it is, I do have to work through that still on myself as a Christian. Like what is the benefit? How much is too much? And if I am really responsible enough to tithe, which we know the wealthy are tithing or giving because that gives them more tax breaks oftentimes, then where is really the heart of this? So if we were all good Christians, maybe it would work. I don't know. Okay. All right, good. Good questions, you guys. So let me give you the next one because I want to make sure we have time to discuss these. So I'm sorry for all the weird typos here, but it doesn't count if you don't mean it. Well, I didn't mean that. That's not you. I don't mean it for you, right? I don't know how many times in my life people would talk about beaners and they'd be like, but LaDawn, you're not a beaner, right? I don't mean you, right? So we use an individual guilt model to explain just about everything that goes wrong, so it's easy to confuse intention with consequences, because we know that these things that are being said and the way that things are working in our society have consequences. But we believe that if our intentions are good, then nothing bad is going to happen from them. Okay, this is where a lot of folks are coming from. You know, that joke is harmless. It's just funny. Why are you making such a big deal about it? Right? Women object to the consequences they don't like, and men defend against conscience intentions because they didn't feel they had it. I don't know why I put that up there. Okay, women object to consequences they don't like, and men defend against conscience intentions they didn't feel they had. So he puts this in there as an example of gendered language. So if a man says something like, you're being so sensitive, women are just so hypersensitive, that comment, right? What it's revealing is, man, if a woman were to say, actually, I don't really appreciate you using that kind of thing. I'm actually being really rational and logical right now, right? There's a consequence of you talking to me that way. I feel substandard. I feel like you're not going to listen to me, things like that. And then we see in this case where, well, it shouldn't hurt you because I didn't mean it for all women, right? All right. Johnson goes on to say that meaning comes from culture. So men can think that they're just being nice guys without realizing the patriarchal system that they're promoting. This is kind of one of the things he's mentioning. Or men may not consciously intend to put women down, but what men do often does put women down. For a lot of women in this country, we've gotten to a place where opening a door is very, it means something different than you're being a gentleman. And this is what he's referring to. So sometimes we have a hard time with this in our Christian context because we want to see chivalry. We want to see gentlemen, right? And especially depending on where you come from. My husband's from the South. So when we first started dating, I was like, every door was opened, every thing was carried in for me. And I was like, I've been to 32 countries. I've gone backpacking by myself in South America. I can handle opening a door. So it kind of took us learning how we serve each other to figure out, for him, he is serving. But in many cases, it isn't a service. And there were some times that he was doing things because he fundamentally believed that he was the stronger person in that, right? So I'm being a little vulnerable about my own life here, but, so we had to work through that. How does that look? How does that work, right? So meaning comes from culture. So another one that people use is, I'm one of the good ones. Bad things happen because of bad people. Gosh, I don't know how many times I've heard, because we visit the South a lot, so people use a lot of blunt language, but there's a difference between, there's a white person and then a honky, and then there's a black person and there's and then there's a Chinese person and then there's a, Mary Sue or whatever. They just come up with all of these kinds of things, and what they're doing is saying, making distinctions. Well, there's good people of color, there's good women, and then there's bad people of color and bad women, right? So, but the truth is that our silence on these things, when we're not the ones speaking up, because the majority of people, I don't know if you guys have ever seen that movie, the documentary called Color of Fear. I'm throwing another thing at you to look up. It's on Vimeo for free right now. The Color of Fear. It's never that for free, but it is right now. Where there's individuals really it's a secular environment, but they're having a very raw conversation based on this. And one of the gentlemen in there says that his biggest fear isn't the person who's blatantly racist. His biggest fear is the person who's law-abiding, upstanding, loves God, moral, honest, with people in his, community. That's the person he has the hardest time with, because there's these secret embedded prejudices that they don't even realize that they have. So when people get off the hook by saying, well, I'm not doing this bad stuff. I'm not the one perpetuating racism. I treat people fairly when I interact with them. I don't treat women lower or less than me, that kind of thing. What he's saying is that actually the silence of that actually is a passive acceptance of the issue. It's not a way to get out of it. So it's the acceptance of everyday privilege that goes along with the group membership that person is a part of. Not recognizing the privilege is part of the issue. So it all makes us want to just be much as part of the problem as any member of the Klan. So being quiet and silent on these things is as powerful and destructive as someone who is blatantly out there saying what they believe. And then, sick and tired. The feeling of being annoyed by something that they feel put upon. Thus, it can seem as though it's everywhere. So things like, I'm so sick and tired of the people complaining. I mean, we've got an African-American president. What's the problem? We've overcome racism, right? We hear these kinds of comments. just sick and tired of people complaining, right? This can actually coincide a lot with blaming the victim. I'm so sick and tired of people complaining. Why don't they just, okay? So this discussion disturbs what he calls the luxury of obliviousness, which is part of being privileged. I don't have to know what's going on if I'm a person in a place of privilege. I don't have to question my whiteness or my maleness if I'm in a position of privilege. I don't have to question, and this might hit home for some of us, I don't even have to question my ableism as a person who has every aspect of my physical body, because it just is. And society's set up to benefit me. I don't have to think about it. Very recent that we had the ADA, American Disabilities Act, come into play, and it was because people that were disabled started to protest. And they literally, people who could not walk, they literally climbed themselves up the stairs in front of the, I'm forgetting the building in Washington. There's a lot of stairs. They literally did a protest and crawled up to show people how difficult it is to access a public building. And that's when we started to see change. So obliviousness is a part of privilege. And it disturbs that when we have to get on the hook or start thinking about the things that are outside of our everyday life. So life is hard for everybody. Don't bring us down with your troubles. We've got troubles of our own. I've got my own stuff going on, right? That's how we do it. So sick and tired is a defense. It is used as a defense. If I could have your attention. Put in the last 20 seconds. Try to wrap up your conversation. All right. Thank you, guys. I could tell that this was a really, really hearty discussion, and I'm very anxious to hear just some of the feedback that you guys have from this discussion. Like, what were some of the things that were presented in the group in terms of these excuses that people use? Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot.
That's okay.
We talked about, I was in the Black Lives Matter session yesterday, and we talked about the idea of riot shaming and of vilifying the radical, the extremist, quote unquote, the people who climb up the steps, the people who do go into lunch counters to sit in, the couples who sue states and the federal government to get marriage rights. You know, we vilify those people because they disrupt the luxury of obliviousness, right? And the importance of radicalism to changing systems of power, you know, and were it not for the radical abolitionists, were it not for the radical civil rights people, were it not for the radical women's rights and suffrage rights, these people would have been content to just let them continue as is, right? So in order to kind of break this luxury of obliviousness, there has to be a kind of thing that is a thorn in the side. You have to be a thorn in the side of the, you know, and that's, especially when you link that to Christianity, that's vilified as being immoral and wrong and anti-law and order. But that's easy to say when you benefit from the system as it currently situated.
Yeah.
So, we were just kind of talking about the implications of that.
Yeah, and it's a whole heck of a lot of work for people that are in these marginalized groups to have to try to educate and push back and keep doing that. It's a lot of responsibility and it's a lot of pressure to be a member of those groups that you know, and to recognize that mobility might be the only way to address some of these things. So good. Yeah. Oh. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of going off about what we were talking about. Well, we talked about a couple different things, but I mentioned I go to Seattle Pacific, and we at our big Christmas party this year, we had a group of students and some staff and faculty who were doing sort of Ferguson, Michael Brown protest during the Christmas party, and this mom who is a mom of a student and I guess a big benefactor for the school posted on the Facebook page I can't believe this happened during the Christmas party. This is Christmas. This is not the time for this kind of protest, and just that whole idea of the luxury of obliviousness. We get to choose Christmas is not the time for us to be talking about this, and they're saying even
just that like politics are seen and like racism is seen as this separate like political like negative issue that like it's like politics are a part of our life, and it's like our decision making, and it shouldn't be set aside from like not during the holidays and like not at this time, and that's like a privilege of the people in power to set that aside.
That's great. Good example. Yeah.
We kind of touched on this luxury of obliviousness towards the end too, because I was saying how incredibly invalidating it is for people to look at situations and say like that it's like not their concern. Whereas somebody who's like I experienced like my mother could have done everything right to like send me to college, but still is such a struggle, and people like don't understand that. And for people to say like don't bring us down, like we're all in the same boat, or like it's like, well, are we? Like not really. And to like for people to complain about us like struggling, it's so like it's saying that my problem's not real, and I think that applies to a lot of things. But yeah, I thought that was incredibly
Great. Good. Yeah.
We were going to talk about microaggressions because a lot of times these responses fall into that category. And I was kind of saying, like, it's a little bit ironic when I hear, like, oh, I'm sick and tired from, like, privileged people. And a lot of them are my friends. So I just, like, I want to have a lot of praise for them, but it's just like, okay, I've gotten actually literally sick, from the things that you're saying are making you tired. So, I've been to the hospital for, like, stress-related things that were inexplicable to me at the time. And, and I have, like, most privileges as, like, an Asian male who's, like, English-speaking and a Christian, like, straight. And so it's just like, if I'm going through, like, actual sickness caused by stress, like, what are other people going through, and what kind of sickness are they going through, and, like, that's, like, like killing people,
Yeah.
And that is making them literally sick, and, at times just fatally, because, stress is, like, a huge thing, and, sometimes it's just pushing people out of workspaces, and if they can't get, healthcare and all this stuff, it's like this whole structural thing, and it's like, well, I'm offended, so that's making me sick and tired, period. It's like,
Right.
that's a little bit of a weird phrase put at me.
Right. Absolutely. Good. Yes.
I think going through all the different slides and the last part of the presentation, I was thinking about the times, even recently, where I've used some of these excuses myself. And I think that was a little bit of a dig in. I've read the book before, and so even thinking that still now, it is very easy to still slip into those excuses myself, because this work is hard.
Yeah.
That it hurts, and it gets very tiring. And I think even being at a conference like we are here, that it can be very easy to kind of slip into this, like, well, what can I do? How can I battle and overcome some of these things? And so I think for me, the train of thought that I was going was how much we need to encourage one another to continue to press on, to continue one another, to continue to have these conversations despite how tired, despite how difficult, despite how sick it may make us feel, that it may feel like there's not going to be any sort of rest, or that we're not going to be able to continue to breathe, and that there may be times where it's very easy to slip into saying one of these sort of excuses ourselves.
Yeah.
So I think kind of the need for those that are committed to this work, like we are, to continue to encourage one another to press forward, because it does get better.
Yeah, absolutely. Every time, even in my classes that I teach, I hear, what do we do? So we've learned this. We know this is a reality. Now what do we do? And it's always frustrating for me, because if I knew the answer, like, we wouldn't have these racism, classism, ageism, ableism, sexism issues in this country if I knew that there was an answer that would, like, one size fits all. What I do know, and that what I appreciate about this particular conference, is that even the theme of this conference is beloved, right? To me, offers a sense of rest and peace in knowing who I am in Christ and how God sees me. And knowing that every aspect of my story was designed for purpose. And, as hard as that is, it's hard for me because just giving you guys a little bit of information about me, I know I don't look very Hispanic which has always been a struggle in my life because I'm not Hispanic looking enough to be accepted, and I'm not white enough, so I'm like in this kind of gray area. When I was going through high school, my family, my family was in poverty. My dad had a college education, but because he was Hispanic, his first language was Spanish, even with his college education, guess what he did for a career? He was a house painter. How stereotypical. But that's all he could find. This is years ago, okay? That's all he could find to work to support his family. So I grew up in a community that did not appreciate my name, LaDawn Prieto. They didn't know what to do with that. They did not know what to do with that. And I was reading at an early age, all of that stuff. And when I got to high school, I remember filling out my 4-year high school plan. I wanted to go to college. My dad had gone to college. Got my classes, all fundamental classes. Fundamental English, all basic classes. And I'm like, this is not going to get me to college. So I go in, make an appointment with a high school counselor. I ask the high school counselor, like, what's going on? And she's like, so well-meaning, but literally I will always remember what she said. Honey, people like you don't go to college. We need to be realistic. Okay. Now, I know this is happening to a lot of people. These microaggressions are happening on a daily basis. There's things going on, and many of you guys came to this conference wanting answers. And the only thing that I can do is just lead you back to the only place that I in my life have ever been able to find a sense of peace and comfort in knowing who I am and who I'm created to be, and that's in Christ. That's the only place that I've been able to find that rest in knowing that I am his beloved. Right? So as much as I want to be able to get everybody on the hook, because that's Johnson's big thing, like, we need to get on the hook, not off the hook, right? We need to be reminded of this stuff. As much as I would love to be able to do that, I know that not everybody's going to get on the hook. And I know that my circles of people who understand me and see me for who I am and want to spend time to get to know me are very small. They are very small. One thing that I just wanted to kind of close with is, just a time of you guys just together, maybe spending 5 minutes, because I think that's about all we have. I wish we had more time. Just reflecting on the theme of this conference and the information that you guys have been presented to today. And I'll say this really quickly. I believe that every step that we take, that God provides us opportunities and areas of influence. And even if you feel like I'm not going to be the person who's going to be out there protesting, you have people in your direct path that you have influence over. Whether you believe that or not, you do. And God is intentional in using the gifts that you've been given to be able to use them in that path as you walk along in your life. And looking for opportunities in whatever ways are on your heart and whatever gifts that you have. Not everybody's going to be a John the Baptist. Not everyone is going to be that loud voice of, hey, come to reason, right? But you have your ways. God's intentionally put people in your path to influence in this way. Okay, and I think that's the biggest responsibility that you have walking away from this conference. Now what do I do with all of the stuff that I've been given to the people that are right here, right now? What do I do with that? How do I impact and influence that?
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.